Dobrý deň, ak by som vás mohla poprosiť, že by ste si zobrali vaše miesta.
So, good afternoon. If you can please go to your seats so that we can start.
Tak ešte raz, dobrý deň, vítam vás na...
So once again, good afternoon. Welcome to the conference called Sustainable and Affordable Energy Security in Times of Transition. So let me give the floor first to the Vice President of the Senate, Jitka Seitlová. I'd like to welcome you all. And really thank you for coming here today to discuss this topic and to share with the others your ideas, your experience, your observations. Because the topic that is in the title of the conference is a challenging topic. So when we were thinking about organizing this conference some 2 months ago, we were living in very difficult times, also for the Senate, because the Senate was re-electing its leadership, and sort of nobody knew what would happen. We still have our mandates, but our positions in the leadership of the Senate come to an end, and we have to re-elect the leadership. And also the chapters in our budget are coming to an end, because we always have some packages or chapters of financial allocations for various conferences. So before we received a new allocation, we couldn't be sure that we'll be able to meet here. The chair of the Committee on Public Administration unfortunately sent a message to me today that he will be busy in the afternoon because he's also a mayor of a small municipality, and in his municipality the local gymnasium burned down, so he needed to go there. But he promised to at least try to make it in the course of the conference, so hopefully he will join us later on. So it is my pleasure and my honor to officially welcome you, and it is great that we can meet here in this beautiful hall. It's one of the most beautiful halls that we have in Prague. And as I said, we'll be discussing a topic which really is not easy. It's a challenging topic, and you know, first I was given 5 minutes for my speech, and then 10 minutes, and I just thought, well, this would be for a whole day for me to talk about, so I can try to say at least what's most important. So first of all, let me highlight that COP27 came to its end. And we know that when it comes to adaptation or mitigation measures relating to climate change, and it's one of our topics as well, we know that all these measures are progressing, but there is de facto no global agreement on how to do things sustainably. So you hear all sorts of news that there will be some kind of a fund, that the richer countries will try to help the poorer, and you also hear that the common will and the global understanding across our planet is yet not sufficient, even though it's getting better. And just recalling 1997 or 1996 in November, that's when our First Republic's Senate renewed its functioning. So the Senate started to function again in 1996, and then in 1997 the Senate Committee on Public Administration and Regional Development and Environment adopted a resolution saying that we should pay attention to climate change and necessary measures. So that was back in 1997. So a lot has happened since then. Things are moving forward, but it's still not enough. In the Czech Republic, we have +2 degrees Celsius. Globally, I believe it's 1.3. That's the latest information that I've heard. But to be able to maintain sustainable climate on our planet, we have to do more. We haven't done enough yet. And so sustainability, that's the first key word, and affordability, that's another key word in the title, and energy security. You all know that in the Czech Republic, and most of you are from the Czech Republic, we haven't paid enough attention to this issue. And for a very long time, we have relied on coal, and there were huge struggles about carbon limits and noise limits and dust limits and so forth. And we even had public hearings about that in the Senate. So coal mining, that was one of the topics that we were dealing with in the Senate. And I believe we helped it a lot, because at least there are some deadlines for coal mining. And I hope that when it comes to coal mining and dealing with the volume limits set, and also the time limits set, that will be a topic of a presentation of one of you, I hope. And then again, using public sources for energy security. That would be, again, for a whole conference, for a separate conference. And speaking about nuclear energy, I have many colleagues that discuss whether we want nuclear energy or not, and what we should do with nuclear waste. So we know that the so-called taxonomy in the EU has changed, and it's more forthcoming, more open towards nuclear energy. And the Czech Republic pays a lot of attention to nuclear energy and believes that nuclear energy will save us. But I personally believe that it is not a long-term solution for us. Yes, maybe in the short term, when we have to overcome this difficult situation, and they're thinking about the same or along the same lines in Germany as well. So maybe preparing one more unit of a nuclear power plant, or prolonging the life cycle of the existing ones, yes, maybe. But there are also other technologies that are being developed, such as hydrogen, and but all of that is still in the cradle. And what we can and should focus on are renewable sources of energy. And as I've said, the Czech Republic hasn't paid enough attention to it. Recently, we've opened a number of calls for proposals for various subsidy schemes for renewable social energy. And we also opened these programs to a wider public, so that people can reach to a subsidy of not only 14% of the overall investment, but 40%. And there are certain indications that it could go up to 80% for some types of renewable energy. So we had to start thinking more about replacing fossil fuels with more renewable sources of energy, and we were forced to think about it mainly because of energy security. And I realized that when I started to be more active in politology, and I didn't study it, but one of the first things that I've learned in politology was that states were established mainly for the purpose of providing security. And the question is whether the state, our country, or the European Union is capable of providing energy security to its population, of course, in the context of the current war crisis. So that's a challenge that our government is facing at this moment, and it's a very difficult challenge because you have to provide energy security not only for large enterprises that want to manufacture, that want to produce, but you have to provide energy security for every single citizen that at least needs to get some heat over winter, or needs to get at least some basic energy to exist in this world and to live in a healthy way. So sustainable and affordable energy security in times of transition, that's a very wide topic for discussion. And today we will hear many experts, people that are specifically focusing on various parts of this wider topic. And I hope that this conference will help us, again, make a step forward in what we have to provide, and that's sustainability and affordability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like also to welcome you here on behalf of the organizations collaborating. It is Greenpeace, Czech Republic, Hnutí DUHA, Friends of the Earth, Czech, and Fact on Climate Change. So EU takes care for the energy crisis, and also with the result of the war which affected this area. Energy crisis is closely connected to the climatic crisis, and the climatic crisis is in fact the background of all our projects. So that's why we would like to initiate this discussion, which will help us to consider this issue. Energy transformation based on the energy savings, energy efficiency, and renewable resources is the path to the energy efficient and neutral Europe. It will help us to prevent the energy crisis in the future and will also assist us in protection our whole households from the energy poverty. As we understand, Russia can't be the main source of the fossil fuels, which the crisis in Ukraine showed us. That's why we have to consider the possibility of the safe energy supplies to Europe. The energy efficiency and energy security is closely connected to the lives of people who are struggling in Ukraine. That's why, based on the Paris Climate Agreement, we need to reach the cooperation and solidarity between European countries. In this conference, our speakers will speak about the energy security in two levels. The first panel will deal with the energy in the throes of the crisis, impact and solutions, and the second panel will deal with the vision for a safe and sustainable future of the Czech and European energy sector. I would like to wish you pleasant and fruitful discussions.
A my se teď vystřídáme s řečníky.
And now we will give the floor to speakers of the first panel.
Tak já děkuji, paní místopředsedkyně.
I'd like to thank the Vice President, Mrs. Seitlová, and Miriam Macurová from Greenpeace for opening of this conference. And My name is Stepan Bizi. I am from the Center of Transport and Energy, where I am responsible for the issues related to climate and energy policy. And I would like to open this panel, Energy in the Throes of the Crisis, Impacts and Solutions. As already mentioned, we will in fact consider the present crisis and what outcomes and what solutions we see in the present situation, in order to be able to adopt some short-term as well as long-term solutions of the energy security issues, in order to also to reflect the climatic changes. I would like to welcome Jan Rovenský from Greenpeace, Czech Republic, head of the energy campaign of Greenpeace, Aleksandra Tomczak, the member of the European Commission Vice President Cabinet, and Mr. Timmermans, who is responsible for the energy policy. We are still expecting her to connect us. But then I welcome here Hana Konrádová, the head of the Department of Energy and Heat Sector from the Ministry of Industry and Trade, Mr. Klusáček, the head of the Analysis and Strategy Department of Platform for Social Housing, and Jiří Koželouh from the movement Rainbow, Friends of the Earth, Czech Republic. As already mentioned, we will consider the solutions, possible solutions of this crisis. As it has been already mentioned, the energy security has not been defined as the sufficient supply of raw materials and energy, but also there is the aspect of affordability and sustainability, reflecting the approach to the environment. So these are the components which we deal today with. I will ask each of the speakers to make the short introductory word, speech. Each of them will speak for about 8 minutes, and after that you'll have the chance to raise your questions. So that's all on my behalf, and I will ask Jan Rovenský to make the first presentation.
Čest být v panelu jako první. A moje prezentace bude poněkud neobvykle.
So thank you. My presentation will start from the end because I started with some starting points and that brought me to some conclusions. But actually, if I have only 7 or 8 minutes, that's just enough time to present the conclusions. So these are basically just points for discussion. It's nothing carved in stone and nothing that I would be really certain about. The situation is so difficult to orientate yourself in it, and it's so dynamically developing that I believe you cannot find a solution that would apply for the upcoming 30 years. So we can only talk about the individual pieces of the whole puzzle. So my presentation will be just a starting point for a wider discussion. It's not that I'd be convinced about one perfect, ideal solution. Maybe with the exception of my first point. I think that the current situation has proven that the current paradigm of the energy in the Czech Republic has been wrong. We kept being focused on how to solve the energy crisis in the Czech Republic only, and we forgot that we're at the energy market of the EU with 27 systems. And it seems seems to me that our colleagues from the legislation and the executive branch of the leadership of our country started to understand that. And they can see that without the help of some of the other countries in the EU, we simply could not be able to survive, because the gas that we had in our storage tanks disappeared, and we needed supplies from the others. So I would call on the EU to develop an energy security strategy that would provide energy security for the whole of the EU, all the 27 member states. So a market or a strategic approach to energy. That's my second bullet point. In the past, let's say 15 or maybe 20 years, the market approach has been dominating. The market will solve it all, and it had its advantages. If you look at the chart, the curve of the development of energy prices, basically up to 2021, energy prices had not been growing, practically not been growing, while inflation was still existing. So the market functioned and provided cheap resources for us. But unfortunately, the market doesn't have any airbags, anything like that. So it works efficiently if there's no crisis, but it's not fit for crisis like the current one. So the question is how much we're willing to pay for energy independence and energy security. And we don't know what will happen next winter, and we do not want the current crisis to repeat itself in the future, when it could be even worse than what it's now. Then we also should not confuse the necessary emergency measures in the current crisis with long-term measures. We're at this moment resorting to measures that maybe a year ago we would have rejected, and that applies to the whole political spectrum. But it shouldn't become a long-term policy approach. At some point we will have to step back and think about not what will come next winter or in 2030, but what we want to do in 2050 and how we want to provide energy security in 2050 in the EU. So we have to differentiate between the tactics and the strategy, long-term strategy. And we also have to realize the risks of replacing fossil fuels. Of course, Russia is a hostile regime, and if we replace it with energy coming from other dictatorships, well, maybe it is a short-term solution for now, but it definitely should not be a long-term solution that will get us out of the current dependency. And also the end of complete end of the import of Russian fuels within 2 or 3 years. Well, it basically already applies, but I think that when the war is over, there will be a huge tendency to restart imports from Russia. And I think that after what we've gone through, we shouldn't forget that, and we should resist these temptations. And also another bullet point, the necessity to eliminate all the barriers for the developing renewable sources of energy and find more savings. And Senator Seitlová has talked about that. And the Czech Republic is lagging behind, and it's a shame. Maybe you saw it in the media, even though it was not such a high-profile issue. But what happened this year was that small private investors asked to connect 11 to 15 gigawatt of energy sources to be connected to the main grid. That's roughly 5 times to 8 times of the installed capacity of Temelin nuclear power plants. So these are small decentralized sources that people want to have connected to the grid. And We haven't counted on that, and the system is not ready for that, even not in the energy strategy that we prepared in 2021. And the people will have to be rejected because the grid is not ready for that. Also, prevention of energy poverty, that's an important and long-term thing. And the government sort of saved it for the time being, even though it was 5 minutes to 12, so to say. But still, there are long-term solutions that we have to look at. In the rural areas, many people have houses which are not properly insulated, and they do not have enough money to co-finance the grants that they could get from various grant schemes. So in the end, most of these people, or many of these people, will spend a lot of money on heat and collect subsidies from the state, and it's not a good solution. Looking at Italy, their green savings program functions up to 110%, in the meaning that you get 10% more to your investment, I believe, if you insulate your house. So we could look at the Italian program and prepare something similar for our rural areas. Another starting point is more abstract, and it relates to a debate which is quite hot in our climate movements and climate aware public, and that is whether one of the solutions, and the only solution, is not to grow or to continue growing. I'm a fan of complete decoupling. That is, that we would continue to grow, but it would be decoupled from energy consumption, but that's an ambitious, maybe overly ambitious solution. On the other hand, the idea that we'll be able to stop economic growth, that's even more ambitious. The third alternative is business as usual, but that, of course, will hit one day the physical limits, constraints of our planet and its systems. Another thing that would need to be debated or redebated is the European industrialization. It is nice that we're decreasing the emissions in Europe, but we also have to say that quite a large portion of the emissions are outsourced to other parts of the world, such as China. So it is not enough to decrease emissions that we produce in Europe, but we have to be more and more self-sufficient in production, or we will import the products from countries that are climate responsible, like Europe. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is one of the solutions, and EU is working on that. And last but not least, using LNG for cogeneration, which is a part of our capacity reserve. But for the future provision of stability of our energy system, I believe that is important. And maybe I will leave the rest of my presentation for the discussion if we actually make it to the discussion, because I exceeded my time allocation already. Thank you. And now if I can ask Aleksandra Tomczak from the European Commission, the member of the cabinet of the Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Timmermans, Franz Timmermans. She should be connected online and will speak English, so if you need interpreting, switch to Czech.
Yes, good afternoon. Can I first check if you can hear me? Yes, okay, perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me to this debate. I am very honored to be invited on behalf of the Cabinet of the Executive Vice President Franz Timmermans, who is responsible for the European Green Deal here in the European Commission. I was asked to present what the European Union, what the European Commission have done in reaction to the energy crisis that we have been challenged with since February this year, actually also even since before that. And so I wanted to take a few minutes, if you agree, to take you through the main points of our strategy on how to address the current energy crisis. And I wanted to start a little bit with taking stock of where we are. So since February this year, we have reduced our imports of Russian gas. We have gone from 40% of reliance on Russian natural gas to 9%. Anyone who has been following the energy sector and the energy balances in the European Union knows that this is something that nobody would have expected to be possible to happen over such a short period of time. We are also at 95% of storage filling across the Union. So the conclusion that we draw is that for this winter we are on the safe side, but that the next winter will be more challenging because between March this year and the beginning of the gas filling season next year, we have lost some of the Russian gas supplies that we had used to fill our storage that will help us get through this winter. And most importantly, we have managed to secure the volumes of gas that we need, but we are paying an extremely high price for that. Energy prices right now are, everybody knows, at historic highs, both from gas as a fuel, but also for electricity. This has a tremendous impact on our societies, on the consumers. The vulnerable consumers are the hardest hit because they had the highest share of their income spent on energy services even before this crisis. The situation for these consumers is becoming unbearable, and the cost of living crisis as a result of this is hitting many Europeans across all member states today. It is also an extremely challenging situation for our industries. Our production of aluminium, of steel, of fertilizers is at extremely low levels. So while we think about how to survive this winter and next, we also have to think in parallel about how to make sure that the European industry also survives this energy crisis. What we have done over the past few months, I think it is fair to say that we focused on three pillars. The first pillar is how to manage our demand of gas. And here all the Europeans have been making huge gas savings. This is done already based on the price signal, because prices are so high that the demand is naturally reduced, but also in a managed way, because a well thought through and well managed demand reduction is always better than demand destruction, which is driven by prices. And it is a managed demand reduction that we want to achieve as part of the so-called Safe Gas regulation, a framework that we proposed to member states, and member states agreed to in July this year, to save 15% of gas that we had been using over the past 5 years on average. Why is this important? Well, if we annualize the gas flows from Russia that we are not getting today as Europe, that represents 100 billion cubic meters. So it means that on an annual basis, we are going from 150 to 50 billion cubic meters of Russian gas, and that represents a big part of our gas consumption. Our total gas consumption in the EU is 400 billion cubic meters, so that represents 25%. And if we manage, all of us, to reduce our gas demand by 15%, it means that we will save 60 billion cubic meters of gas on an annual basis. That's more than a half of what we are not getting from Russia today. And it is the cheapest way of addressing this crisis, because the energy that we don't consume is the energy that we don't pay for, and money that doesn't go to finance, to help the Russian budget. We have also put in place so-called gas storage regulation to make sure that despite the crazy gas markets that we are observing, we are putting aside, we are storing enough gas to go safely through this winter and next winter. This was absolutely necessary because the usual price signals that the markets rely on to store gas, that means importing gas during the summer when it is cheap to put it in storage so that private companies can then sell it more expensive in the winter, was not something that could happen in the current circumstances, because in the summer gas was more expensive than in the winter. So had we not intervened in the market, we most likely would have seen very low levels of gas storage across the Union, and that, of course, would have been extremely dangerous for the European economy and for Europeans. So demand management is the first pillar of what we do. That's also the fastest way of acting. The second pillar is accelerated deployment of clean energy technologies. Across the Union, consumers, Europeans, have realized that it is much safer to have some form of decentralized and homegrown energy production that doesn't rely on coal, which has also increased in price, that doesn't rely on gas, for which we know we had problems with the security of supply. So renewables are really at the core, and accelerating this transition is really at the core of this strategy to get rid of Russian fossil fuels. This strategy, we first adopted it in March 2022, so a few weeks after the unjustified and brutal invasion of Russian Federation on Ukraine. And back then we said that we could reduce Russian gas imports by 2/3 by the end of the year. We have now surpassed these expectations, and we are importing 75% less than what we had been importing in the past. But to accelerate renewables, which is sort of a no-brainer investment or no-regret investment that you can make in Europe today, because renewables are simply much more cost competitive when it comes to the levelized cost of generating electricity. And if you compare it to all alternatives, whether they are fossil-based thermal generation, nuclear, etc., the levelized cost of electricity is much lower of renewables. But how to accelerate this when in some member states it still takes 8 years to give permits for the installation of these renewables? That's why in November this year we have also proposed a regulatory framework to accelerate the permitting of renewables, to replicate very effective one-stop shops that have been developed in some member states, in other member states, to ensure that there is enough administrative capacity to deal with the permit requests, and also in the longer term to put in place so-called go-to areas, which are designated areas with high renewable energy potential when permitting can be done faster. We also know that many member states have put their own campaigns in place to accelerate the deployment of heat pumps, the deployment of rooftop solar panels and other clean energy solutions, which can help consumers directly become more resilient, independent, and have access to more affordable energy. But with all of these efforts on demand reduction, on accelerated clean energy deployment, we still might not be able to close our energy balance this year and next year. That's why there are two things happening in parallel. On one hand, we see higher consumption of coal in a number of member states. We have seen that trend happening in Poland, in Germany. I don't know the situation in Czechia, but I'd be interested to hear. it is something that we see across the Union. Now, does this mean that our plans when it comes to Green Deal transformation and climate neutrality are put on hold? Absolutely not. We see from the work with the coal regions in the EU that none of these regions are stepping back on their ambition to transition to new fuels. What we also realize is that coal is a finite resource. The more we drill, the more we extract today in Europe, the faster these coal fields will deplete. This is what we observe in a number of coal regions, that they are already expecting that the transition and the phase out will come faster because the resources are being depleted. And at the same time, it is extremely unlikely that anyone, any investor, any bank will provide financing for opening of new coal deposits. So this is a trend which is irreversible, and it's irreversible not only for the reasons of climate and pollution, but also for the reasons of pure economics, because it is simply not affordable option to produce electricity anymore. And now, what about gas then as an investment? I think 2 years ago it would have been an easy choice or straightforward choice in many Central and Eastern European countries to transition from coal to gas and to renewables. Today, this transition from coal to gas is much more difficult from a project perspective to get financing, to get an understanding of where gas prices will be evolving in future is extremely difficult. That is why what we observe also is that some of this gas demand that we could have expected to replace coal demand will most likely now be transitioned directly to clean energy solutions, but not all of it and not immediately. That's why in the Repower EU plan, we acknowledge that Europe will need some very targeted investments in gas infrastructure. And infrastructure that we can then use for renewable gases, for biomethane, for renewable hydrogen. But these limited and targeted investments will be needed. We are talking about a number of LNG terminals, mainly floating terminals. We are talking about some more interconnectors that are being discussed at the level of the EU. But in the grand scheme of things, these investments are likely going to represent only 5% of the overall investments needed to realize the ambition of getting rid of Russian fossil fuels, because the vast majority of these investments just make sense to be invested, to be located and placed in clean energy sectors. Right now, just to finish, on prices, because demand reduction, will not solve our problems. In the meantime, at least not all of our problems. In the meantime, consumers are paying an extremely high price. What do we do about this? We have put in place a framework at the beginning of this autumn to generate revenues from the electricity market, so-called cap on the revenues of inframarginal producers. This can generate, together with a solidarity levy that we introduced, which is basically a levy on fossil fuel companies that have made big profits over the past few months. This can generate 140 billion euros across Europe that we expect to be directed directly to consumers, to support consumers, vulnerable consumers as a first priority. That's on electricity prices. We are also working on the reform of the electricity market design, which we will table in the first quarter of 2023. On the gas front, today the College of Commissioners is discussing a market correction mechanism that we were requested by the European leaders heads of state and government to propose before the next meeting of the Energy Council under the Czech presidency, which is happening in 2 days. So very busy work program. I hope I have been thorough and clear enough, and happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Moc krát děkujeme Aleksandře Tomczak za úvodní příspěvek a teď bych poprosil Hanu Konrádovou.
Thank you, and let me give the floor to Hana Konrádová from the Ministry of Industry and Trade. Well, good afternoon to all of you. I prepared a presentation on energy legislation, and I agreed on that with the organizers because logically the Ministry of Industry and Trade is a guarantor of the energy legislation, and of course we respond to the current situation as it was described by the previous speakers. So since spring this year we've been working on various legislative acts. You can see the list of 7 amendments to energy legislation in the Czech Republic. It's an unprecedented situation, but of course we have to respond to what is happening on the market. So in my presentation I will focus on only the last 3 amendments to the Energy Act. Those are the most topical ones, but on the list, on the slide, you can see also the other amendments, such as the one relating to a savings tariff for households, because we've heard that the current crisis very much hits households and vulnerable groups of population, and we're getting to a situation when even the middle class is having problems to pay for electricity and gas. So the Chamber of Deputies responded to it with new amendments to the Energy Act to help solve the situation. So the most important step, I believe, is capping the electricity prices, thanks to the amendment to the Energy Act that we adopted in September 2022. So the aim of that was to guarantee a price that would be affordable for the public, and also the state budget would be able to finance it or co-finance it. So the Ministry of Industry and Trade then continued with 2 more amendments of the Energy Act, focusing on speeding up the development of renewable sources of energy. And we called the amendments, or we gave them certain titles. It's easier for us to communicate about them. So Lex Renewable Sources of Energy, RES number 1, is in the 2nd reading in the Chamber of Deputies, and the 2nd version of that is now going through the comments procedure. The colleague from the European Commission also mentioned the European legislation that the national legislation has to respond to. That's the adaptation amendment that the Chamber of Deputies approved last Friday, and that relates to the windfall tax of energy companies. The last amendment on my list, we call it a transposition amendment, and the aim of that is to transpose the still missing provisions that we still have to have in our Energy Act. So I'll skip parts of my presentation to have more time for the discussion, but as for capping the prices, that is possible thanks to the legislation which says that in extraordinary emergency situations the government can do that in relation to electricity and gas. It can also put certain constraints to trading with energy. The government hasn't done that yet, but it's hard to say how the situation further develops. I believe it will not be necessary to limit the trade. Of course, the energy trading companies can be loss-making because they have to buy the energy for market price, but have to sell it to the final consumers for the capped price, and the state budget should cover the difference. The price cap is 5,000 Czech crowns for megawatt hour for electricity and 2,500 for gas, and that's without VAT and without the distribution fees. The capping of the prices relates to basically all customers using low voltage. These are households or small and medium-sized enterprises, and the same applies to electricity and gas. So that's one of the measures. And then the government also determined another group of customers with higher consumption of electricity or gas that will also fall to the ceiling group. These are mainly organizations providing public service, such as schools or medical facilities, social services, sports organizations, culture, and so forth. But also municipalities, administrative regions, and their organizations and institutions and legal entities. So all of these organizations should be subject to the price ceiling. As for enterprises, the government resolution is focusing at small and medium-sized enterprises, but apart from the fact that they have to fulfill the definition of an SME as it is set out by the European legislation, we're also providing the cap on the price for only 80% of their consumption from the previous period. There are also two more amendments of the Energy Act that are in the legislative process. Lex Arias 1 that has gone through the second reading and will be discussed in the Economic Committee next week. And the aim of that is to simplify the whole process for smaller installations of renewable sources of energy in households or small enterprises up to 50 megawatt hours, I believe. And the government proposes that these small sources wouldn't need to have a license for production, so that will simplify the red tape around it. And there's also another amendment of the Building Act to simplify the whole process, again for these smaller sources of energy up to 50 megawatt. So they will not have to have a permit for the location of the construction site, which is one of the many permits that normally they would have to acquire. So we're trying to simplify the administration, the bureaucracy, and the whole permitting process. In the Chamber of Deputies, there were a few amendments that they added to the bill, and the ministry agreed with these amendments. For example, the producers of renewable sources of energy of up to 1 megawatt would be producers built in public interest, so to say. So often there is some public interest involved, such as cultural or social or any other, but the legislation did not properly reflect it. So what we're saying in the amendment is that even the larger resources of renewable sources of energy could fall under the public interest category. The next act, as we call it, Lex Renewable Sources of Energy 2, that is an amendment to the Energy Act, focusing mainly on community energy. That act has been in the preparation process for a long time, and I'm looking at Senator Seitlová because she knows that we had many roundtable discussions about that, and the local government sphere is eagerly awaiting this amendment because that amendment should allow the possibility of establishing energy communities or energy societies that will allow to share energy within a community. And the specific consumption points will be determined in the legislation. There will be a description of a vulnerable customer as a consumer point and so forth. So there are also measures and provisions focusing on small producers that are at the same time consumers, such as households that want to be connected to the grid and deliver energy to the grid while also consuming. So these are the major changes that we've been working on recently on the energy legislation, and I hope it will help our discussion. Thank you, Mrs. Konrádová from the Ministry of Industry and Trade, and let me give the floor to Jan Klusáček from the Platform of Social Housing.
Dobré odpoledne. Já bych jenom doplnil, chybí tady na prezentaci loga Hnutí DUHA. Společně s Platformou pro sociální bydlení, iniciativou za bydlení právě jsme vlastně dokončili studii k energetické chudobě, která teda bude zveřejněna příští týden, a vy tady máte teda exkluzivní možnost vidět nějaká první zjištění, která z toho plynou. Celá studie je založena na datech o životních podmínkách Čechů, které sbírá Český statistický úřad. Je to skoro 9 000 domácností. Jsou to ta data, z kterých se vychází při veškerých statistikách o tom, kolik je v Česku chudoby, jak jsou na tom domácnosti příjmové a podobně. Tak můžeme poprosit další. Jo, tady mám. Tak. Ta prezentace bude teda stručná. Za prvé vůbec k definici energetické chudoby, potom nejohroženější skupiny, které z toho vychází z té analýzy, a také k hlavním řešením těch strukturálních příčin energetické chudoby. Tady ještě poznámka.
Who are the most vulnerable groups? And all this issue is focusing on the situation who faced the energy poverty already before the price increase of the recent years. In fact, that's the intention, because that's the population which suffers from the long-term horizon, and the Czech Republic has to solve it in the long-term perspective. So here you can see the chart which shows 3 basic indicators we worked with. The indicators, in fact, reply the methodology of the energy poverty definition determined by the University of Economics. So we replicated the method and adjusted it a little bit. As you can see, the greatest part of the population facing the energy poverty, about 1 million of people who faced it already before the price increase, are the people whose greater share of incomes goes to the energy. So then the other categories were affecting about 200,000 persons. I believe that these figures will increase now due to the high level of the energy prices. But these were the people who had the problems with heating, even when the prices were lower. As it has been mentioned here several times, that we are speaking about the energy poverty. It's necessary to say that this category covers people who have the great share, who face the fact that their expenditures going to energy are higher than 16% of their income. So people who pay more than 16% of their income to energy, which is twice as high as the average, which is 8%. Well, it doesn't seem that the figure is so high. We are not speaking about millions. We are speaking about 1 million of inhabitants. But speaking about poverty, we really need to speak about people who face the poverty. We also, if we made the survey concerning the effect of the price increase to the living standard of people, the figures will be different. But now we are speaking about people who are really facing the threat of poverty. So who is the most vulnerable? Here you can see that there are big differences between the categories of families. So these are the low-income families, the single parents, and not all pensionaries, but the pensionaries, single pensionaries. On the other hand, there are some other pensionaries. I mean, the pensionaries who are living in couple. If we are speaking about the lonely pensionaries, these are mostly ladies, 80% of them. And other pensionaries are the pensionaries who share their household with some other person. And the other low-income, so other families which are no low income, we can see that there the share was much lower. So in total, we are speaking about 900,000 of inhabitants. So it's 9% of the whole population. So we can see that the price increase for energy affects everybody in our country, but here we can say that there are certain categories which are really endangered by this poverty most. The greatest group of these people represent the people who are renting their flat. Well, so if we imagine people living in their own houses, we have the feeling that they could be endangered most. But the population using the rental housing is endangered more because they have to pay the rents and the price for energy. So then they are more vulnerable than the others. There is another reason for this, that also in the blocks of flats, the energy demand is much higher than in the family houses. Especially this concerns the flats or apartments which are rented or leased compared to those which are used by the owners themselves. So how can the situation be solved? Here I am speaking about the solutions which should help the population which in fact suffers with the danger of poverty despite of the high prices of energy. So one of the solutions could lead to the mitigation of the difficult financial situation. Here we can see that the allowance to housing can mitigate the situation. Of course, we can solve the situation through some subsidies to the energy prices, but here we are speaking about people who are using the housing allowance. Of course, there are certain limits determined, so then it in fact helps these people in such a way that if their costs of housing represent more than 30% of their income, these people are enjoying the allowance of 4,000 Czech crowns. Most of those people who are facing the danger of the energy poverty is entitled to this allowance. Well, that's not the structural solution because it doesn't solve the sources or causes of the situation, but it can assist to the solution of the low-income population, which faces the poverty due to the high costs of their housing.
Příspěvku na bydlení to ví, tady máme teda menší problém, nebo spíš větší, a to je to, že většina těch domácností.
You can see that most of these families entitled to this allowance do not use it, do not enjoy it. Exactly 70% of people entitled to it have not applied for it yet. So the matter is that the right to this allowance should be accompanied by the services which would assist people in drawing this allowance. So here we see the possibility of the long-term structural solution. It means the establishment of some contact points where people could come and could ask for the assistance in applying for these allowances. But the experience says that it's necessary to adopt the act on the support to housing, which is now drafted by the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. And this slide shows the other solution, and namely the reduction of energy demandness of housing. The last column shows the people living in rented houses, and there you can see the flats where the energy demand of the house is demandness of the house is too high. So these people were living in the houses where the energy demand was more than 90 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. So looking at the other houses where we determined the different limits, that the limit was 120 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. We see that in fact the energy demand of the housing fund of the Czech Republic is much higher than in other EU countries. And based on that, we proposed the levels of the contributions which the people could enjoy, but at the same time we need to reduce the energy demandness of housing.
Poslední úvodní příspěvek.
Well, thank you, and let me pass the floor to Mr. Koželouh from Friends of the Earth, Czech Republic, DUHA movement, the Rainbow Movement. Thank you. I will further elaborate what Mr. Klusáček mentioned in his presentation, and I'll focus more on the reasons of energy poverty. So, if I sum up the current situation, the prices of energy are skyrocketing. Of course, it has economic effects, and those that are most hit are the poorer people in the society. And what we've heard in the previous presentations, the other problem is that we're wasting energy, so the energy performance of buildings is poor, so the demand for energy in houses is really high. So this is the same chart that you saw in the previous presentation, and I intentionally included it in my presentation as well, because I want to remind you that there are certain categories of people that suffer from energy poverty, and some of these people had problems even before spring 2021. And it's partly because of poor energy performance of buildings, be it family houses or flats. So the current skyrocketing prices of energy lead to the fact that many households are no longer able to pay their energy bills. So when we talk about energy security, a part of energy security is also to provide for energy consumption of people, of houses. And even though we have enough energy at our disposal, if it's not affordable, it's no good. So energy security is not just to provide the energy as such, but the energy also must be affordable to the people. If it's not affordable, then energy security simply does not work. So capping the prices of energy, that was the main response of our government. And I think it is necessary and it is important. The caps on the prices should also prevent extreme fluctuations of prices, but of course it does not prevent the spreading of energy poverty. Because if you look at the prices before the crisis and the capped prices, of course, the capped prices are sometimes even multiples of what the prices were before the crisis. So, of course, I'm not indicating that the capped prices should be below the price level before the crisis. That would be a very expensive problem for the state. Very expensive solution to the problem, rather. We're not ready to such skyrocketing prices, and that's why people are more affected by energy poverty, and that's for a number of reasons. First of all, we're not protecting sufficiently the vulnerable customers. Our legislation does not define a vulnerable customer. It does not define energy poverty, even though it should have been in the legislation according to EU laws. So since we don't have the definition in the laws, we cannot provide a targeted assistance to these vulnerable households. How could we change that? Mrs. Konrádová was talking about an amendment to our Energy Act, Lex OZE, which is Lex RES number 2. So that amendment provides a definition of a vulnerable customer, but that definition focuses mainly on the health condition of the person or whether he or she collects some certain health allowances. And we should extend that definition of a customer or of a household which is under threat of energy poverty. We should extend it with various social criteria. So we have that housing allowance, but just as Mr. Klusáček mentioned in his presentation, the majority of households eligible for that allowance simply don't ask for it. They don't apply. So we need a more systematic and targeted approach to help these people. And the new amendment to the Energy Act extends these possibilities. So again, we either could provide capping of prices or have some kind of savings tariff that these vulnerable groups would be eligible for. Also, we should decrease our dependence on fossil fuels, especially those that are imported from risk regions. If you're able to get 50% of subsidy to your investment into renewable sources of energy, then of course it is obvious that such a program scheme is targeting groups that have some financial savings, a certain financial pillow that they can use to co-finance the remaining 50%. The new green savings program called Green Savings Light is another step forward. That program was opened only recently. In my opinion, it's too late because we have been aware of the need for such a program for a long time. We need to adopt certain measures rather over summer before winter comes. So it's a good step, but just a partial step. The new green savings program can finance, for example, replacement of windows in houses which are more insulating or provide for better insulation. But it would be easier to extend the definition of what it can fund, such as various comprehensive renewals of insulation of houses. And we should provide a higher percentage of subsidy, not 50%, but let's say up to 95% of the investment costs, so that everybody who needs it can tap into those sources of funding. And we should search for other sources of help, of assistance to people that live in apartments, especially if you have a low-income family. Even if they own their own apartment, they're not able to contribute more into a reconstruction fund, for example, that can then be used to insulate the block of flats or do other measures. So we will have to find ways to motivate the owners of blocks of flats, those that rent out their apartments, to adopt various energy-saving measures. And we also need low-threshold counseling centers for people that are not so skilled in bureaucracy. So people have to have a contact point where they can go and receive advice in terms of what needs to be done. What also increases the risk of energy poverty is the slow development of renewable sources of energy, especially small sources that households install for their own consumption of energy, such as photovoltaic panels on the roofs. So connecting these producers to the grid is really slow. And the system in the Czech Republic rather prevents people from installing their own photovoltaic systems and to use them for their own consumption. And also, it is not yet possible to share your energy production locally, in your local community, in your own village, for example, to share it with your school or other houses or neighbors. Such community systems could help decrease energy dependency. And also these energy communities can better reflect various social aspects of the members of such a community. And for example, they can they can supply that energy to some of its members cheaper. So if we further develop community energy systems, it could function more on social basis than on market basis. There is hope that the system will change. And again, I'm speaking about the amendment of the Energy Act, the Lex Renewable Sources of Energy 1, that should simplify the red tape. And also there's amendment, there's the other amendment, Lex Renewable Sources of Energy, RES 2, that should allow for the establishment of energy communities and sharing of energy locally. That could be a good start to community energy development. There are certain drawbacks. That amendment, for example, includes a provision that could allow energy trading companies to change contracts one-sidedly. So if you're a customer and you stop consuming, or you consume much, much less thanks to energy community, then the energy trader can one-sidedly change your contract and increase the price. So we still have to work on these amendments to help develop the local energy communities in the Czech Republic. And the fourth bullet point, the last one, which is important in my perspective and which is a certain handicap, is that we have a very old energy strategy. The state energy strategy still relies mainly on coal and gas, and nuclear power plants is viewed as the main development goal, as the route to go in the upcoming decades. And the current energy crisis convinced us that if we want to provide sufficient volumes of affordable energy to households and industry, we have to decrease, or we have to improve the energy performance of buildings, for example, and operations, and lower our energy dependency. I think that the Czech Republic is in a unique situation because we have all sorts of financial sources to finance energy transition and to combat energy poverty in the future and provide for energy security. We can use various European sources of funding, also emission permits or various loans from the National Recovery Plan. That's what the Czech Republic's government is thinking about. And we can use these funds to finance various measures that should help solve the current crisis, such as higher taxes, higher windfall taxes, or increasing the dividends of ČEZ, the Czech energy company, and so forth. So it is a huge challenge to get rid of energy poverty and provide for better energy security, and at the same time focus on the climate crisis. But I believe that historically the Czech Republic is in the best position when it comes to available financing for all these needs. And that situation will not repeat in the future, so we should use it. And last but not least, let me tell you that as Friends of the Earth's Czech Republic, the DUHA movement, were a part of an association together with Greenpeace and other organizations. So we joined forces and we tried to help people directly, especially those people that need some help or assistance with energy savings and with how to get financial assistance from the state. And we're also doing our best to eliminate energy poverty, or at least mitigate it, and to eliminate the causes of poor energy performance. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jiří Koželouh. And before I give the floor to you in the audience and open our discussion, I would like to ask Aleksandra Tomczak. Have a question on you, because in the beginning of our panel we heard that we sort of have to move away from the national understanding of energy security to the more European level of energy security. And there are many initiatives on the side of the European Commission, or at least it's underway. Of course, the Repower EU package, that's the one that came in effect already. But I wanted to ask, do you see any potential for deeper cooperation apart from, for example, joint purchases of gas? Because that's something that we've already agreed on. Is there any further potential how to deepen our joint energy security in Europe?
Thank you very much for this question. And I would say that energy security is not a new topic for the Union. We have been working jointly on making ourselves, for example, more diversified in terms of gas deliveries for quite some time. Thanks to these efforts over the past 10 years, we can actually survive this crisis. I think, if the same situation had happened a decade ago, we would have been in a much more vulnerable position, because over the past 10 years, we have invested as the European Union via the Connecting Europe facility in a number of interconnectors on gas, in a number of LNG terminals across the Union, and that means that there are no more any member states that don't have access to at least two different sources of gas supplies, thanks to the interconnectors and the LNG. Also, when you look at our scenarios for this winter, we are able to say that we are on the safe side, that we will have enough gas for this winter. But this is assuming, and these scenarios have been done by NSOG, our EU-level organization bringing together transmission system operators of gas across the Union. They have done these scenarios for us to model, how will our gas storage and gas demand behave this winter and next winter, assuming that we still import the same amount of gas from Russia as today, and assuming that we have absolutely no more gas deliveries from Russia. All of these scenarios, and we can be safe for this winter because we have 95% of storage and because we're saving 15% of gas as a union. But a precondition for this is to continue having gas flows throughout the union. So we are all interconnected. We can all help each other in case one of us or a region is affected by an emergency situation. If we stop these gas flows, if we interrupt the interconnectors, this will have dramatic impacts on the security of energy supply for member states individually and for the Union collectively. So this European perspective is totally built into our energy systems. And today we can say that that our security of supply is not threatened thanks to the European cooperation. Without it, we would have been in a very, very difficult situation. Not only talking about high gas prices, but actually gas shortages, which is not the case today. So I would argue that this energy union is already a reality. Now, can we make it deeper? Of course we can make it deeper. You mentioned joint purchasing. We agreed to do it, yes, but now we have to make it work. And this is complicated because we are having discussions, for example, in the Council under the Czech presidency. Should we all commit to procure certain amounts of gas together? For example, 15% of storage. This is what we as the Commission propose. Or should it be voluntary? We think that we should all commit to buy a certain amount together, because we need a sufficient scale to start this new project. The public entities have not been buying gas for a very long time. We have privatized many parts of our energy sector, and especially of the gas sector. So in order to enter this market, in order to make a difference for the European consumers, we need a scale. And so joint purchasing is agreed via political commitments, but to operationalize it, it's still a lot of work. It's still a lot of work, and we still need the political commitment now to translate the commitment to concrete actions. What else can we do? We need to also continue working on interconnections for electricity. This is absolutely necessary because some of the member states have big potential in sun technologies, others in wind technologies, others have a low carbon baseload. We need to be more interconnected if we want to reduce the cost of the energy investments. So there is much more that we can do together. But let's not, how they say, put the cart in front of the horse. Let's try to do things step by step. Let's make sure that the solidarity that we have on gas, for example, is operationalized. We have proposed to member states sort of default solidarity agreements on gas between member states. These solidarity agreements were supposed to be in place on a voluntary basis, but they are not. We have a huge delay in this. Let's make sure that this is operationalized. Let's make sure we start the joint purchasing. Let's continue the good cooperation on renewable energy technologies and take things step by step. And let's also not forget to communicate to our citizens that we can be safe today thanks to the fact that we are working together as a union, because the media space is dominated by all sorts of views which are often undermining our European cooperation. And the facts are very clear. Today, we wouldn't have been safe. We wouldn't have energy security if it wasn't for the fact that we are together in an interconnected energy system and in an energy union.
Děkuji. Ještě bych položil možná jednu otázku pro paní Hanu Konrádovou z MPO, protože vy jste tady zmínila celou řadu novel, které jsou teď.
So maybe one more question to Hana Konrádová from the Ministry of Industry and Trade. You've mentioned many processes and steps that go in the right direction, but you also said that our state energy strategy is quite obsolete. It's very old, and the program statement of the government says that next year that strategy should be reviewed. So I wanted to ask whether you're already discussing that review at the ministry, and what do you think about including all these principles that we've mentioned into the new strategy? Well, thank you for the question. I'm not really the one in charge of this at the ministry. It's another department, a strategy department that deals with that. But they have already started on this review of the energy strategy. But we have to realize that we also have a national energy and climate plan, which is another document created based on the requirements of the EU. So we can see already certain changes of the energy strategy, but not all of these processes, of course, have been included. And of course, we have the deadline of doing the overall review of the energy strategy next year. Well, together with Mr. Koželouh, we have quite intensely commented on the previous state energy strategy that was approved in 2015. And the whole process from the formal commissioning of that strategy, which hasn't been done yet, till the final approval by the government took 4 years. So if our colleagues from the Ministry of Industry and Trade claim that they will make it by next year, well, good luck. Okay, let me now open the discussion to all of you in the audience. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and when asked, please go to the microphone and introduce yourself, tell us which organization or institution you represent, and ask a question and who the question is for. Okay, I can see many raised hands, so let's say that we will start with 3 questions and then have the panelists answer, and then we will continue. Mr. Michal Vojtišek, a professor of engineering at the Czech Technical University. The problem that we have is not only a technical problem. I'm afraid that fossil fuels helped us reach such a level of well-being and comfort that we will not be willing to leave it. We don't want to invest into new solutions and new technologies. And I'm afraid that the government on its own will not solve it. We need citizens to be involved as well. Energy is expensive because there's lack of sources. And the way out is either to replace the sources with new ones or to save energy. And that can also mean that we accept the idea of lowering our standard of living, of accepting a certain economic recession that will come with the increasing prices of energy. So my question is, what should a citizen do? Because you talked about what the government should do, but what should people do, and how should we get that information to the people? Okay, 2 more questions, and then we will ask for the answers.
Action Network Europe, so coming from Brussels. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussions. So I have actually one question for Mrs. Tomczak, also in Brussels, on the gas infrastructure expansion under REPowerEU that we see in as a reaction to get away from Russian gas. So we do see loads of risks that this gas expansion of the infrastructure is actually going way beyond of what is being sort of claimed. There was a 12 billion envelope initially in REPowerEU, and I think this is sort of being watered down. And we see loads of LNG terminals mushrooming and other types of projects mushrooming. So that would be one question. And another question for Mrs. Konrádová. I think you mentioned a progressive pricing mechanism for small and large consumers. I'm not sure I understood that right, but it would be interesting to understand better how that progressive mechanism works and to what extent it relies also then on state support, so subsidy support from the government. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Gennady Kondarev, and I'm with Third Generation Environmentalism, a climate policy think tank. and I cover the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. My questions are to Ms. Konrádová, and there are a few, but they're very short. Just one open question. What is the timeline for the revision of the National Energy and Climate Plan? You mentioned that next summer the draft should be ready, but would the Czech Republic be on time with the revision of this strategy? There was a mention by the International Energy Agency that Czech Republic is currently working on heating and cooling, sustainable heating and cooling strategy. How far is this process? Because if I'm not wrong, I think only Poland has, from the region, has such a strategy already, but the Czech Republic is also expected to release one. These projects that were mentioned in the legislative changes, up to 1 megawatt that could receive a label for projects of public interest. Does this also include projects that are also in the field of heating, or is it only in the power sector? And my very last but more broad question is, what would be the position of the Czech Republic in support or rejecting the higher targets under the RED and the EED directives? The Renewable Energy Directive and the Energy Efficiency Directive. There's currently a notion that the targets would move to 45% renewables by 2030 for the EU, and 13% from 9 to 13% for energy efficiency. Would the Czech Republic say no to that, and if no, why?
Tak já děkuji, to je celá řada dotazů. Začal bych asi tím, co má...
There were quite a lot of questions, so let's start with the question what the ordinary citizen could do. Who would like to start? Well, I will try. In fact, this is the discussion for hours. Well, the simple answer could be that the good citizen in such a situation should behave as the responsible person, but I would say that each should consider whether his or her consumption could be reduced somehow, and whether there are any technologies which allow reduction of the carbon footprint and the energy consumption. Well, then there is the level of the civic society. Well, the government, usually if the government does something, it does it under the pressure of society. So only if we combine these things, I believe we can progress. Whether the progress will be sufficient, I don't know. I've already mentioned it in my presentation, because it could affect principally the living standard. Because in fact in Europe we have 10 years ahead of us to reduce the greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, and the targets seem to be unrealistic at this moment. Well, on the other side, we can have some requirements on the side of a state, but speaking about the energy poverty, the government is aiming at providing people with the possibilities to take some measures on their side, because at this moment we can see that there are certain barriers. Well, there are the barriers for the connection. There are the barriers preventing people to invest if they do not have monies, and so on. So it's necessary to perform certain acts on the side of the government in order people can perform their part of the work, which at this moment they can't do because of certain administrative or other barriers. So we have some results from some search which says that the greatest share of the costs of households is caused by the 85% of the heat and hot water consumption in the households. So the energy performance of houses is really very demanding in our country, and I believe that the state should assist to improve the situation, because well, if the state provides certain subsidies or grants to the owners of the family houses, that could be easier. But if speaking about the big blocks of flats, the solution would be more difficult. Further question dealt with the construction of the new gas infrastructure, saying that it could lead to prolongation of our dependence on gas.
Hello, can I now intervene on the question on gas?
Ano, yes.
Yes, is that correct?
Yes, you can answer.
Okay, great. Yes, well, thank you for the question. So let's maybe take stock where we are. We used to import 150 billion cubic meters of gas from Russia. Now, if we annualize the current imports, we would be importing 50 billion cubic meters over the next years, if nothing changes. That means that we have a gap of 100 billion cubic meters. What to do with this? More or less 60% of this, 60 billion cubic meters, is going to be replaced by demand reduction. The EU collectively is reducing our demand by 15%. That's more or less 60 billion cubic meters. We are accelerating the deployment of renewables. We have proposed the 45% renewables target that was mentioned in the questions. All of this should allow us to replace more gas that we initially expected by renewables and faster. But we will need alternative supplies of gas as a union this year and next year, simply to avoid a societal disaster. I think it is fair to use these words. We cannot avoid plugging some of this gap with alternative gas supplies. But of course, our objective is to limit it to the minimal, the demand that cannot be reduced, the demand that cannot be replaced by clean energy sources. We will diversify. We have identified in the Repower EU plan of May what that could mean in practice. Several new LNG terminals, most of which floating regasification units. What does this mean? This means that these floating regasification terminals are leased by member states, by private investors, and used to increase their import capacity of LNG. You mentioned that they were mushrooming. I would say it's fair to say that for a country like Germany, which has lost all of their long-term contracts that they had with Russia, it is only expectable that they would need several FSRUs, floating LNG terminals, regasification terminals, to be able to go through this winter. The good thing about such infrastructure is that it is leased. It is not permanently fixed. It is infrastructure that can be leased for a specific number of years. So the risk of stranded assets is minimized. In the Repower EU plan, we have made an assessment that we would need more or less 300 billion euros to achieve our repower targets, the 45% target for renewables, 13% target for energy efficiency, and we would need less than 5% of this to go to some of the additional gas infrastructure. Why is this needed? Because we have just lost 25% of our gas supply. And now this gas supply is not going from the east to the west of Europe, but from the west to the east mainly. And that means that, you know, this is not investments to increase our consumption of gas. Our consumption of gas is going to be reduced, and it is massively reduced. But just simply to make it through these very challenging times. And that would be it from me. Thank you very much for the question.
Děkujeme za odpověď. Pak tady máme celou řadu dotazů na paní ředitelku.
So we have many questions on Mrs. Konrádová. There was a question about supporting large entities, and then also the question on the review of the national energy strategy, and a question on the strategy of sustainable heat industry, heat production, and also a question on the position of the Czech Republic when it comes to increasing the aims in energy performance and renewable sources of energy. Well, I'll take it from the last, because I am not a competent person that could give you the final position of the Czech Republic. I don't know how the Czech Republic will vote. It is not up to us, up to our ministry. Also, the energy strategy and the national energy plan. As far as I'm informed by my colleagues, there are no signals that we would not make it by the deadline that was set for us on the national level. As for the strategy for heat production, I suppose that we will be able to meet everything, or all the objectives. And as for the caps, I understood your English, but I wasn't sure what the question was about.
Jo, já jenom, pardon, já zopakuju jenom v krátkosti tu otázku, abychom ji...
Okay, I'm going to briefly recap the question, because it was not on the mic, so that people online hear it. So it was about the support of large consumers and small consumers, and how do you differentiate, and if there are any grades of progression when it comes to the aid, the help. So I talked about what government decided and will come in effect on the 1st of January 2023. The capping of the prices does not apply to large companies at all. It applies only those customers that are specifically listed in the government resolution. So apart from households and small enterprises that use low voltage and are small consumers of gas, there are also other customers that are specifically listed. And especially these would be entities from public services, providers of public services. So the capping of the price was for the whole group as defined by the government. As for large companies, the Czech Republic is following a temporary crisis framework, and our colleagues at the ministry have prepared a program within which large companies can ask for financial assistance, providing they comply with conditions set by the temporary crisis framework. And the capping of the prices for large companies, that's still a topic that our government is planning to discuss. At least there are signals that the government will come back to that topic. Thank you. We have time for maybe one last question, and please use the mic.
Hi, I'm Konrádová from Greenpeace, Czech Republic. My question is specifically for Aleksandra Tomczak, the representative of European Commission, and that's the reason why I'm speaking English right now. In your speech, I noticed one interesting thing, that you mentioned that the European coal regions are still on track to do the energy transition, to do just transition, and I want to ask what would happen if they will not be on track, or if they would want to postpone the transition plans, because here in Czech Republic right now we are witnessing some pressure to enlarge some mines, for example, Bílina mine in northern Bohemia. We are seeing pressure to reopen the mines in northern Moravia, Silesia, and that means that there will be significant mining of coal even in the 30s. And I want to ask what these plans would do with the just transition plans of European Union, and is it also possible that these regions could lose the money from the just transition fund if they would enlarge the mining and prolong it in the future? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. If I may reply directly. We have a very clear legal framework on the Just Transition Fund, which gives us some elements of response, and which also binds us as the European Commission. We have to respect our own law. And what the Just Transition Fund says is that its purpose is to help mitigate negative impacts which are resulting from the closure of coal mines and the reduction of use in fossil fuels in coal and carbon-intensive regions. And it covers the period between now and 2030, if you look at the possibility of extending financing beyond 2027, according to some of the flexibility rules that we have in EU funding. And what does this mean in practice? It means that we don't require coal regions to completely phase out coal before 2030, but there has to be an evidence of the transition starting before 2030. There are then problematic cases where we have seen some cases where, for example, mining licenses for new mining operations were granted, and that mining has not yet started. And so we basically said that when it comes to new projects for the production of fossil fuels, we would analyze this on a case-by-case basis. And what we would look for is that overall, within a region, there is still a decline before 2030 in the overall coal production and use. However, if we see that in a region, because of the opening of new mining facilities, suddenly the coal consumption and coal production is stable, nothing changes until 2030, or that we are actually increasing coal production and coal consumption, then we will not be able to provide eligibility for the Just Transition Fund.
Tak já moc krát děkuji za odpověď.
Thank you very much for the answer. That was the last question and answer of this first panel. So the panel is coming to its end, and now we're going to have a half-an-hour coffee break, which is in the adjacent room. So after the coffee break, you're invited to the second panel as well. So thanks to all the guests in the first panel, Jan Rovenský from Greenpeace, Aleksandra Tomczak, thank you, to Brussels, Hana Konrádová from the ministry, Jan Klusáček from the Social Housing Platform, and Mr. Koželouh from DUHA, the Rainbow Movement. So thank you all for being on the panel, and we can continue our discussions during the coffee break.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.